So hello, everyone. My name is Lili Price. I study illustration and photography at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. I will give out my contact info at the end of class for whomever has any further questions, so make note of that. But also at any point, please feel free to put questions in the chat. I do really love questions. I will have it open, but it is more likely I will address them at the end since there's just so much content to cover. And I don't want to break up the flow of when I'm giving the presentation. I also want to say before starting that this is a Western modern art history class. So by teaching this subject, I do not want to imply it was the only art going on at the time. That's simply not true. Now is also the point I recommend you take notes. I will go through a lot pretty fast, partly because there's just so much info, and then partly because I just talk really fast. So I will also send out a document listing all of the artworks I show here today and a few more. And I can also send the slides if anyone wants those. But if you do want those, reach out to me via my email that I'll give at the end. Another good tip would be to screenshot things, of course, Command-Shift-4, just if you really like a piece of artwork and you want to save it. So let's get started. Modern art. Sorry, my voice is dead because I taught yesterday as well. So to clear something up, modern art is an era. It is a time period. Within the modern art category, a ton of things called movements happened, each building off of the ones that came before it, and each contributing to what we consider art today. So each movement started with a particularly revolutionary goal in mind, and frequently developed into a style or medium or practice we now take for granted. So this is part 2 of a 2-part class. Either can be taken on their own, so don't panic if you didn't go to the first one. But if you would like a more comprehensive knowledge of the subject, do contact me with the info I'll give out later, and I can get you some form of the information so that you're a little caught up. Just for some perspective, so here is what we covered yesterday, focusing on the more aesthetic movements that made art a form of creative expression, rather than just a skill of objective representation. That was entitled The Journey to Abstraction, which is pretty self-explanatory. And here's what we will be covering today, focusing on the movements that all were contributing to a greater social or political society. So this is the time when artists became more than artists, they became activists. So without further ado, let's dive into the first movement of today, which is the Harlem Renaissance. So in the 1920s, you need some background information for a lot of these. Black people in America were experiencing a new level of freedom, but still, of course, were experiencing extreme prejudice. So these two situations in combination created the Harlem Renaissance. It was a movement of African Americans based out of Harlem, all about Black creative expression. A huge part of this goal was to showcase Black success. After having been, reduced to slaves being called property for so long, it was important to have African-American people prove themselves to the rest of American society and really state their place as part of that country. And a huge way that they did that was through music, specifically in creating jazz. So jazz was birthed by African-American people. For those of you who know music, you'd know it was a rather ingenious revolutionary invention in music in the West. So a lot of the visual art from this era specifically celebrated their musical accomplishments. This is my favorite piece here that really just embodies what jazz really is. It was all about constructing a new African-American identity, not ignoring their historical presence as slaves, but showing that they were so much more than that. They were so much more than victims. James Vanderzee, for example, took a lot of commissioned photographs for wealthy Black people in Harlem to shape an African-American identity separate from ideas of poverty. He portrayed them as successful, thus making both white and Black people understand African-Americans were capable of success if given the chance. This movement was also all about celebrating and defining the Black American identity as both Black and American. So for that reason, a good amount of paintings from that time used African motifs, as you can see in the self-portrait with patterns reminiscent of African textiles in the background. It was all about connecting both past and present. So jumping forward in time a little bit, after World War II, there was a sort of renewal of the movement in new ways, but with similar goals, with an emphasis on capturing the current Black political and social experience. This was in the 60s and 70s. It leaned a little bit more directly political than an aesthetic. So for example, take a look at this photograph by a really great Black woman photographer. It is captioned, "Jim, if you choose to accept, your mission is to land on your own 2 feet." That may sound kind of familiar. It is a pretty common expression in spy movies and books, the dramatic, "your mission if you choose to accept it." And then they're given a very difficult, dangerous task. But what Weems did here was write that the super dangerous mission was basically simply to survive. And that's because for Black people in America, that was and still is a legitimate challenge. Weems' photograph pointed out that in a very relatable, understandable way. So I'm now just going to go through some cool concepts covered in this movement because there were quite a few. J. Jarrell created wearable artworks out of textile and quilting, which were both crafts associated with African-American female domesticity. So she represented the art form of quilting in a fine art setting, giving it the attention and credibility that it deserved at the time. Another big concept that African Americans grappled with, and still do, of course, is the concept of the African diaspora. So this is a very complex topic, but to put it in very simple terms, it is the state of being displaced from one's homeland. So African Americans who feel the African diaspora feel a disconnection with their ancestral land of Africa and the land they're living in, the United States. So because of that, collage was a method used frequently to depict that experience because it is literally the combination of multiple sources, much like the Black identity has a combination of African and United States sources. This one refers specifically to African American focus on Egypt and feeling the disconnect from Egypt. I really love this photograph. I think it's just beautiful. Again, like in the original Harlem Renaissance, music was a big emphasis during this time. A lot of work celebrated and promoted Black musicians, especially those who were becoming famous even in white communities and therefore helping to eliminate racist ideas. This is a really incredible photo of Miles Davis, great jazz musician. You guys should check out his album, Kind of Blue. So some new concepts that weren't really covered in the first Renaissance were covered in this one because they had more time, more people, more innovation. So for instance, Lyle Ashton Harris, he frequently made photographic work about his experience as a Black queer man and the philosophical and societal struggles that accompany that. Lastly, it's important to note a very particular group during this movement called the Kamoinge Workshop. This was a group of about 12 Black photographers, one of them a woman, who had a specific goal to make work that was both fine art and photojournalism. So it was a very collective group. They all actually had a home base together and were frequently collaborating and helping each other, really just building up a community. And they ended up doing quite a lot to bring attention to things in the Black Harlem community that weren't being published in the mainstream white-run newspapers. Bit of a non sequitur now. I'm going to try not to do that, but we're going to go back to the early 1900s. We are now going to talk about the best named movement, Dada. So context is very much necessary for this one, as it is for so many of the movements I'm discussing today. But what you need to know is that World War I was really thoroughly upsetting the world. It had not seen anything on that scale before. Many citizens had also not seen anything like it before because war paintings and posed photographic portraits from previous wars did not capture the very unglorified truth about what war is like. As mass media and fast media was invented, people could now see the daily horrors of war. So they were quite upset. And World War I ended quite poorly for the Germans. Their economy and esteem was really hit. And for most people in the country, it seemed for absolutely no reason. They'd gone through devastation for nothing. So that all caused an epiphany for some artists in Germany, which was that everything was absurd. Things don't happen for any reason, and government sucks. So they were really pissed. Nothing made sense in their world anymore. Therefore, they decided to make art that didn't make sense. And in the process, make art that went against everything related to traditional art values. So a very basic art value is originality. Hannah Hosch then introduced collage to fine art. This meant literally using other people's images to make her own art. The only original part was the placement, not the actual images. Other artists went an even more absurd route. So Hugo Ball did a performance dressed in this ridiculous costume, not really resembling anything. You're not missing any information here. And then he started reading a poem comprised of literally random syllables and sounds strung together. It literally made no sense, and that was the point. This piece had also been said to reference the way that governments seemed incapable of adult, clear communication with each other. Hans Arp made art by cutting out squares and dropping them onto a canvas, gluing them down wherever they landed. So Germans like Arp felt that they had no control over what happened, so their art reflected that. They took away artist control over their own art. And another huge thing created by the Dadaists was the idea of ready-mades. So you may recognize the urinal titled Fountain or the Mona Lisa with the mustache. Duchamp was definitely a leader of this idea, which was to place an everyday object in a setting that implied it was an artwork. This begs the question, is it an artwork? Should we look at it differently because of its setting? Why do we consider this art when it's in a gallery versus a tool when it's in the bathroom? So they were asking people to question everything. Nothing seems certain or sensible anymore. Fun fact, it is unknown who originally came up with the idea of the ready-mades, either Duchamp or Miss Freytag Loringhoven. They made the urinal and this piece God, which is a bathroom pipe, on the same year, and no one knows who made it first. So fun thing to think about. And that leads us fairly smoothly into my favorite movement of today, Surrealism. So much of Surrealism too was about making people question life, specifically making them question reality. In this very famous piece, René Magritte wrote, "This is not a pipe," because it's not a pipe, it's a drawing of a pipe. He was pointing out that drawings are not really the objects that they represent. A very important historical thing to note was that Surrealism was greatly inspired by Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst who, though he was wrong quite a bit, really did revolutionize and invent psychoanalysis as we know it today. So most notably to Surrealists, he brought about the idea of the subconscious or the unconscious mind. The Surrealists interpreted this as a whole other world that they were not conscious of, but could potentially say so much more about the world we are conscious of. So take Moreau, for example, who would draw things he saw in his dreams. Surrealists value dreams just as much, if not more so, than reality. So some artists took this really far by using an autonomous method. This means that they would legit shut their conscious brains off and just make without planning, without thinking. Masson didn't even look at the canvas he was working on until afterwards, and then he would name the painting whatever he saw in it. Apparently in this, he saw some fish battling. Others took this in a more conceptual way, like Claude Cahun, a non-binary artist in the 1920s who created a lot of staged photographs depicting them in various costumes, eventually leading the audience to question the rigidity of gender itself. Others like Dali, who you probably heard of, used a lot of symbolism, maybe to get some unclear hidden messages across or to awaken something in the psyche. The clocks in this painting are not rigid as real metal is, and they seem to be attracting ants as if they're made out of raw flesh. Over time, though, this idea of trying to reveal the subconscious turned more into a style made to unsettle. It was drawing unrealistic things realistically. And two sub-movements happened from this idea, the first of which is metaphysical painting. So paintings from this movement are really easy to spot. They almost always contain objects that are juxtaposed in unrealistic sizes, and those objects contain a lot of symbolism. So for instance, in this painting on the right, yes, or nope, I'm wrong, left. The head statue of Apollo references traditional art values. The train in the background stands for modernity. The ball stands for childhood and innocence, and the glove is the hand of destiny. Sometimes, though, they weren't as realistic and clear as that. But the one thing you can always count on in metaphysical painting is that they're always very still, quiet scenes. You can feel the stillness of the environment. So similar idea, magic realism. So this isn't a movement so much as it's a term applied to a category of art that was all kind of going on around the same time. I, with my own art today, could refer to myself as a magic realist. But essentially what magic realism is realistically painted impossible scenes. So like metaphysical painting, there was a lot of symbolism contained in it. There was a lot of meaning in each piece, like this famous Kahlo work, which represents her personal struggle between two conflicting identities, one being the traditional indigenous Mexican woman and the modern independent one. What makes it so different from metaphysical painting, though, is that it doesn't change the scale of anything. It looks like any normal realistic painting. It's only when you take a second to think about the content do you realize it's unrealistic. Like this could look like a very normal painting to you until you realize the people you see standing in line are exact replicas of each other. It's a pattern, not a scene. This is a personal favorite of mine. For those of you who don't know, Pompeii was a beautiful ancient city that started one day as, a cultural center. And by the end of the day, it was completely destroyed by a volcano. So we see here the Pompeii city, but if you look in the back, the volcano hasn't erupted yet. And also there's these modern men standing around in 1930s dress wear. Fun fact, some artists use this style to be very futuristic, in keeping with some of the futuristic dystopian novels that were becoming popular at the time. Mood shift now to a movement you've definitely heard of, pop art. I want to clarify something immediately. That's my bird. It's not called pop art because the color is pop. That's frequently part of the style, like in Band-Aid art and comics, but it's not part of the name. Pop art is short for popular. Art was very much in its own world most of the time, but pop art was for everyone. Everyone could relate to it because the content was something that they'd seen, that they'd started seeing images in their own lives' art. So you didn't need to know about art to enjoy it. And whole new audiences below the wealth line felt like art was being made for them. In particular, the pop artists celebrated consumerism and mass media, all things that they argued made humans more equal. For instance, you may have wondered, why soup cans? Well, it's actually because everyone used that soup brand, incredibly poor people and wealthy people, same as everyone had seen and loved Marilyn Monroe. This was really art for the people. One guy who took this quite far was Clay Oldenburg. If you look closely, those pastries are made out of clay in a very meticulous but painterly manner. So first of all, by recreating desserts that you could find in any supermarket, he was obviously getting across what I just talked about, which is making everything worthy of being in art. But these were actually put in a display case, and he sold each item at an incredibly low price, the same price as if they really were the items they represented. So now art was literally accessible to all classes to purchase. So kind of almost the opposite now, minimalism. So I wanted to talk about this movement because a lot of you have heard this word, and minimalism is really treated like a style nowadays of being very minimal with material or color. And it is fair to use that adjective, definitely. But the original minimalist movement actually had a very specific goal, which was complete and utter honesty. So minimalist art was completely objective and abstract with no resemblance to real things. The exception may be the minimalist photography done by James Wellings. He photographed super close up and very simply material, especially aluminum foil and gelatin, but you can barely tell that what's there. But back to the point, take these L beams. These are just white L beams in a gallery space, in a white gallery space. What they were arguing for is the power of simplicity, because these have such a presence while being just L beams in a white space, an absolute objective truth. They didn't pretend that these were anything else than L beams. So much of original realism was about a simple object's presence in space and how you feel presence even without content. I find this sculpture very funny. It is first of all in black, which is the color of absence, and an X shape indicating something being taken away. So both things that contradict the fact that this is a giant existing sculpture. And this may be the most minimalist piece ever because they are entirely covered in mirror. They aren't adding anything to the space. They're merely reflecting existing space back at you. So in a way, they're creating more space, but they also take up space. Some artists, particularly female, used the minimalist style as more symbolic. One of my favorite artists, Ava Hess, used minimalism in making her pieces appear very simple, but to have deeper meaning things on the interior. So this is just a fun thing to note. I can't not mention. While this is, of course, not at all a hard rule and is less true today, female artists in history have had a tendency to focus on interiority, while male artists focus on exterior superficial presence. Female artists have frequently worked on showing what you can't see. Okay, I'll let that go for now. That's just my personal rant. So now we'll move on to abstract expressionism, which is, again, complete opposite of minimalism. It was made partially in response to minimalist tendencies as anti-minimalism. So as art became more clean, like in minimalism, or commercialized, like in pop art, some people thought that the expressive element of art was being abandoned. And so abstract expressionism was all about mending that. It was extremely painterly and expressive and abstract. For some, it was about conveying deep inner emotions. So Joan Mitchell, who is, by the way, the highest selling female artist in history, was very expressive in this way. This is one of her early works. You can see it's a very blank background and there's very bright colors, very free emotions. It's overall very fresh, as she was very fresh early in her career. And then she had a really happy period as she, gained success. And you can see this expressed in her sunflower era using all bright yellows and giant scales. And then later she entered a depressive period. She had a number of mental health issues. And you can see this new sadness in the muddy colors and brushstrokes. Abstract expressionism is considered the first real American movement, birthed from America. It centered New York as the center of the Western art world, while before that it was always Paris. But what many don't know is that the movement was actually very inspired and influenced by Japanese calligraphy. So Franz Klein in particular was in actual contact with a Japanese calligraphic society. And really, he and other abstract expressionists just loved the Japanese calligraphic gestural quality and used that to influence a lot of their work. However, because of World War II, this all happened at a time during which patriotic Americans were supposed to hate Japanese, including Japanese Americans. Very problematic, obviously. I won't get into all of that, but what it meant for art was that very suddenly this whole inspiration was completely covered up and the movement was written off as a totally American-born movement. In reality, many of the abstract expressionists had an exchange going with the Japanese artists, at least before World War II, and you can definitely see a cross between both of those artistic cultures in both American and Japanese work. It's considered so American because A, it wasn't European, and B, American patriotism was a huge pressure in those days. Otherwise, you were accused of being a spy or a sympathizer, etc. Anyways, more aesthetically speaking, in this movement, a big part of abstract expressionism was autonomous painting. This is what Jackson Pollock was so famous for. Autonomous means, as you might remember, I talked about in Surrealism, you don't think about it, you let your body go automatically, per se. So how Pollock made his canvases was by essentially dancing around these giant areas, dripping and splattering paint as he went along. It was all about the motion, and that's incredibly important for what came next, which is conceptual art. So you just saw in the photograph of Jackson Pollock that his art was really about how he moved across the canvas when he was making it. In the result, you could really see that movement. Which is really interesting because that means that when people look at it and enjoy a Pollock painting, they are not necessarily enjoying just the resulting canvas. They are enjoying feeling the movement that happened to create it. They are interested by its act of creation. So conceptual artists realized maybe it's not actually about the art object at all. If the creation is more interesting than the product, then the product doesn't even have to look like art. So conceptual art it's not my favorite period, but I think this right here is one of the most genius pieces in my presentation. So William de Kooning was a very well-known abstract expressionist. You just saw one of his pieces. The story goes here that Robert Rauschenberg went to de Kooning's studio, explained his idea, and asked him for one of his favorite recent drawings. He then spent a month thoroughly erasing every single bit of it. So what we are looking at here is an almost blank piece of paper, but it's the idea that is interesting. It's the idea that's truly the art. Without X-ray technology, we would never have known what the original piece looked like at all. It could have been a masterpiece. It could have been one mark. And we imagine that it was a masterpiece, which is why the erasing feels like it has so much power. But this whole thing of the idea being more important made it possible for artists to bring up some really interesting points. Like this is one of my favorites here, Kossuth with 1 and 3 chairs, asking, what is the real meaning of the word chair? Is it its definition? Is it the image of a chair, or is it the physical object? So Sol Lewitt designed this mural, but in reality, many murals are physically created by other people other than the artists, especially ones in specific locations. The artist is the one who makes the plan for it. So Lewitt made waves by declaring that this wasn't the art piece, this was. If you were to buy the art piece, this is what you'd get. This is him directly stating that the idea is what matters. He's selling an idea, not a specific art product. And because it was no longer about the final product, some artists like Robert Rauschenberg with his erased de Kooning drawing decided to make art about the absence of art. So Nam June Paik, who was, by the way, the pioneer of video art, made a long film composed entirely of just a white screen with occasional scratches and static on the film. It was all about deleting society's whole idea about the elitism of art. So Douglas Webbler, for instance, set up a poll in a museum asking people to anonymously write down a secret that they never told anyone. Then he collected them all and put them into a book. So no narrative, just a collection of very personal secrets from people we don't know. This meant the artist wasn't actually the creator of the piece, the audience was. Similarly, Ivo Partum created a giant bag full of words on slips of paper and then dumped it out in various locations, which let the wind decide what order the words would fall in. She would record them and then make that her poem. Some were a little more aggressive and straight up anti-art. Vulture made a ton of these little matchboxes and distributed them in a museum. The matchbox really contained matches, and the box instructs them to burn every art piece in the museum. And then the box tells them to use the last match to burn the box itself. So not even the box itself is considered art because it is being destroyed. But burning the box doesn't destroy the art because the art is the idea, the experience of burning up all this art. So again, begging the question, do you even need a product, period? And that leads us to performance art, when art no longer cared about a final product. So if art was all about the idea anyways, why do you need a physical object to represent it? So yes, Klein here covered women dancers with blue paint, and then they would either lay down or dance on a giant canvas. The imprints that they made were considered the art. But what he actually thought was an incredibly important part of the art was the performances were live. Audiences could watch it happen. So eventually, of course, artists stopped having a final product. They believed that a performance or an experience for the viewer was much truer in conveying a message. And there were a lot of messages during this time to be talked about. So the 60s and 70s in America were a cultural crisis. A lot of social revolutions were taking place, aiming for human socio-political equality. Miro Lederman Euclides did a lot of performances in which he would legitimately clean the museum or gallery space, sometimes even live there while she did so. She was exhibiting maintenance, thus exposing maintenance and lower class workers and what they did every day. So she questioned, why is this stuff on the gallery walls given so much more societal value than the work I'm doing or the work real maintenance workers are doing? Why is there such a huge payment gap between the two? Another artist spent his first 4 days in America alone in the same room as a coyote, a real coyote, symbolizing how much danger immigrants go through to get to and live in America. A real influential duo in the performance art world was Marina Abramovic and Ule. Marina Abramovic, as I know, is still working. I don't know about Ule, but they both stood naked in a narrow doorway that led to the gallery. So all gallery visitors had to walk between them. This became a sort of social experiment, which revealed which naked form, male or female, people would rather be facing or putting their back to. A number of performance pieces, especially those of Abramovic and Ule, involved danger, actual threat to the lives of the artist. Frequently, that's the point, like in this other Abramovic Ule piece, in which they demonstrate fragility of the line between life and death via leaning away from each other, holding a loaded bow and arrow. What to get most out of this, though, is that performance art marked a complete fusion of art and life. So these two performance artists tethered themselves to each other with a rope and didn't remove it for an entire year, which explored human relationships, but it also just proved that life itself is art. This also marked a point in art that a lot more female artists participated in and became known in, frequently with feminist prerogatives. So many mediums were male dominated because of history, and it was so difficult for women to get noticed in them. But since performance art was a whole new medium, they could launch themselves in it without dominating male competition shoving them down. So here Yoko Ono sat on a stage and audience members were instructed to cut off a piece from her clothing with scissors. Women would participate a little. They'd cut off a strap or a small square of fabric, but a lot of men would cut off significant parts, revealing more and more of her body. So it really raised consciousness of men's objectification and exploitation of women's bodies, and made them accountable for pretty much the naked state that they left her in at the end. This brings me to feminist art. We're almost at the end here. The 60s and 70s in America, as I mentioned, was full of civil rights movements. One big one was second wave feminism. So super brief summary of a lot of history here. There are three so-called waves of feminism defined by their time periods and different goals. The first was the suffrage movement, fighting for political rights for women, mainly to vote. The second, which was this one here, was all about social freedom and rights. It emphasized female collaboration, female body empowerment, and sexuality, and consciousness raising of everyday sexism. The third is the one we are in now, which emphasizes media usage and intersectionality. A huge part of the second wave, though, was something called the feminist art movement. It's literally called that. It was female artists doing all of those feminist goals I just listed. So for this piece, the artist hung a clothesline down an LA beachfront, and passerby women were instructed to write down one way they experienced sexism. And so in a short while, people could see the sheer number of women who had experienced discrimination or abuse. A lot of feminist artists focused specifically on female artists and how they were left out of history or ignored, an issue still happening today, but significantly helped by the women in this movement. A very special group during this movement was called the Guerrilla Girls. This was an anonymous group of women artists who pointed out sexism in the art world, later expanding to racism, ableism, and beyond. They organized protests and shows and created posters like this saying, less than 5% of the artists in the modern art section at the Met were women, but 85% of the nudes were of women. They frequently used humor to make their messages more popular and paid attention to. I love this piece, The Advantages of Being a Woman Artist. My favorite sarcastic lines include, being in the revised versions of art history, and not being embarrassed by being called a genius. They did a lot of work to reinstate females in the art history narrative. So Mary Beth Edelson created this collage, all of current female artists. And Judy Chicago, along with a lot of other women she collaborated with, made this giant installation of a dinner table with settings for women throughout history. So as you walk around the table, you see these representations of women who should be recognized and should be famous. There was a huge importance on informing the public during this movement. This is a movement I highly recommend looking into on your own, just for the sheer volume of ideas covered, same as with Harlem Renaissance. Barbara Kruger did some great design work pointing out how advertising and media is so aimed towards making women seem airheaded. Cindy Sherman created a series of photographs in which she embodied all the stereotypes or female archetypes portrayed in film to prove the superficiality of them. And Ana Mendieta did a performance in which she meticulously applied this facial hair, demonstrating the fluidity of femininity and masculinity and questioning what it means to be feminine and beautiful. She also did this series, which I love, Distorting Her Body, which was so beautified and sexualized by men. She also did a lot of work in nature. So I gotta say a tiny bit about Ana Mendieta, since she's one of my favorite artists. She had to leave her parents and homeland of Cuba when she was a child, trying to escape dictatorship. And as such, she grew up feeling a real longing for a true sense of home and for a mother. She then came to believe that Mother Earth was the ultimate mother and that Earth was her home. She believed it had the power to connect all human beings, regardless of race, ethnicity, class, or gender. So a lot of her work embedded her own body into the earth, becoming one with it, becoming one with that line that connected all of humanity. And that brings me to the last movement of today, earth art. Pretty explanatory name, but Mendieta was definitely a pioneer of this with her Silhouetta series, which did what I just mentioned, feeling her body's connection to the earth. Because what this did was really point out how important and powerful the earth truly was. Therefore, the earth art movement was also quite anti-consumerist and frequently anti-minimalist, since they didn't like how industrialized and impersonal that style was. The number one thing to remember from this movement is that they used earth as their medium. Many were trying to convey the beauty that earth could make that humans couldn't. This incredible piece is actually composed of hundreds of metal poles which attract lightning. Lightning is still rare, and it would only be there for a fraction of a second, but when you did see it happening, it was unlike any other experience of looking at art. It was metaphysical and a very spiritual experience for some people. Others during this time of cultural revolution were rightfully trying to push ideas of care for the earth and sympathy for it. Richard Long walked a path back and forth, and then photographed the result, which showcases and symbolizes the negative effect that human beings have on the earth. And that's what I really want you to get out of this class in general, as we're at the end, is how much these artists used art to say something. This is the answer to that question: can art really make a difference? It did. In all of these different ways, from outrage at World War I to encouraging an understanding of the subconscious, to anti-elitism of art, to anti-racist or feminist environmentalist agendas. So hopefully this can get you thinking about what you as artists want to say, or at least appreciate what these artists have done in the past as activists.